In the stillness of night, when the candles have burned low, some say you can hear her. A faint weeping, muffled as though it comes from behind stone, rising from the walls, disturbing the silence of the church. A sorrow no hymn can drown. Curtea de Argeș Monastery, the building that could never be built, stands as witness to the legend of Meșterul Manole. It is one of the most famous and foundational myths in Romanian culture. In the heart of Wallachia, in the 16th century, the land was a patchwork of forests, rivers, and hills that seemed to breathe with their own ancient will. Towns and villages clung to the earth, as though in fear of being swept away by the passing of seasons or the whims of rulers. Among them rose the court of Prince Neago Basarab, a man whose ambition was whispered from the cobbled streets of Târgoviște to the monasteries nestled among the hills. He was a ruler of careful charm and calculated strength, whose eyes lingered on horizons not yet drawn on maps, whose thoughts measured wealth and beauty, and whose dreams carried the weight of eternity. The culture of Wallachia in those years was rooted in Orthodox tradition, steeped in the rhythms of church bells and the murmured prayers of peasants who tilled fields and tended flocks. Monasteries were not only places of worship but also bastions of knowledge, art, and political influence. A prince's favor could elevate a monastery to prominence, and a monastery in turn could sanctify a prince's memory. In the minds of the people, the stone was eternal, the walls a bridge between heaven and earth, and the builders were the silent servants of divine purpose. Yet even in devotion, ambition can twist, and a ruler's dream may demand more than faith can offer. Neago's eyes turned toward Curtea de Argeș, a site perched between the Argeș River and the hills that flanked it. It was a place where earth met sky, where mists gathered at dawn and lingered through the day, wrapping the land in a veil of quiet. The prince envisioned a church unlike any other, its walls a testament to artistry, its arches and towers reaching as though to claim a piece of heaven itself. Among those summoned to bring the prince's vision to life was a master whose hands could coax stone into forms unseen, and whose destiny would soon be bound to the walls of Curtea de Argeș Monastery. Manole arrived with his tools and his reputation. Around him, other craftsmen gathered, men of skill and patience, their eyes bright with hope, their hands ready to shape marble and timber. They were proud, confident in their work, yet no one could foresee the trial that lay before them. From the first day, the labor was harder than any could imagine. The sun rose over scaffolds, casting long shadows across foundations, and the walls they had raised in daylight would collapse by night. Arches cracked, pillars trembled, and the carefully laid stone refused to hold. Each collapse was a quiet defeat, a humbling of skill, and a reminder that human hands alone might not be enough. Days turned into weeks. Each attempt drew the men deeper into exhaustion. Fatigue became a constant companion, frustration a shadow that clung to them, heavier than the stones they lifted. They began to sense that this was no ordinary construction, that the walls themselves demanded a devotion beyond skill, beyond endurance. Manole pondered the failures. He inspected the collapsed walls, traced his fingers along fractured stone, consulted plans and sketches. He tested the mortar, adjusted the angles, replaced beams, yet each night the result was the same. No mistake could explain the walls that collapsed without warning, the arches that buckled, the foundations that crumbled. They began to whisper of curses, of angered spirits, of something older than themselves watching from beneath the earth. Some considered leaving, fearing both the labor and the murmured threats carried by shadows and wind. Others, driven by duty, pride, or fear of angering the prince, pressed on. The work continued, each day an act of defiance against both stone and fate. As days passed, the monastery waited. The ground, the walls, the air seemed to pulse with a quiet patience. The master builder and his men labored without relief, their sweat and toil measured against a force that did not yield. And somewhere, In the silence of stone and timber, there was a sense that the true test was yet to come, and that the monastery, so close to rising, yet so fiercely resisting, would demand a payment unlike any they had known. Night had fallen over Curtea de Argeș Monastery. Exhausted, Manole drifted into uneasy sleep. And in that darkness, a vision came to him. The walls could rise, the arches could hold, but only at a cost no man had yet named. In the dream, he saw the monastery completed in perfection. Stone firm, towers reaching to the sky, carvings delicate as lace. And beneath it, a human figure, beloved and fragile, enclosed within the walls themselves. A chill ran through him. The land, it seemed, demanded more than skill. It demanded a life bound to stone. Morning came, but the vision lingered. Manole spoke little to his men, urging care and devotion, concealing the terror he carried. The sight seemed heavier, charged, almost aware. Walls still collapsed, arches still failed, yet he knew the secret. Only a sacrifice could still the stones and secure the monastery. The next night, the dream returned, sharper and more insistent. The monastery would stand, the vision promised, but the price would fall not on him alone. A shadow of inevitability settled over his thoughts, a quiet warning that beauty often comes at the cost of life, and that some creations demand more than hands and effort. The sun had barely risen when Manole gathered his men at the half-built walls of the monastery. The air was thick with dust and unease, weeks of failure hanging like a shadow over their shoulders. Stone that should have held still trembled under their gaze, and the men glanced nervously at one another, sensing something greater than skill was at play. Manole's voice was quiet, yet it carried over the sight. He spoke of the dream that had haunted him at night, of the vision where the monastery stood complete, arches unbroken, walls enduring, yet only at a cost no man could ignore. The men listened, fear threading through their confidence, as he described the demand whispered through shadow and stone, a human life, offered willingly or chosen by fate, to bind the walls and still their restless collapse. A heavy silence followed. Then, with slow and uneasy nods, the craftsmen agreed. The first woman who came to bring them food would be the sacrifice the monastery claimed. Pride and fear wrestled within them, yet all knew the walls would not rise without this payment, and all accepted it, though dread threaded every heartbeat. Whispers broke among the men, some trembling with dread, others muttering of curses and omens. They had labored for weeks and still the walls refused to hold. Now the cost was named, and the horror of it settled over them like a shadow heavier than any scaffold or fallen stone. Manole gave no comfort, only the certainty of the vision and the knowledge that without this payment, the monastery would not rise. The hours passed in uneasy silence. The masons worked mechanically, aware that the walls demanded sacrifice, aware that the first woman to appear with bread or water would seal her fate, yet powerless to alter it. And in that tension, the monastery waited, patient and inexorable, as though it had known all along that human hands alone could never satisfy it. From the distance, Manole saw Anna approaching, carrying food and water. She was his wife, the companion of his life, and his heart seized with dread. He fell to his knees among the stones and prayed with all the strength of a man who loved beyond reason. He begged God to send wind and rain, to knock down trees across her path, anything that might turn her back and save her from the sacrifice the monastery demanded. The air remained still, the sun rose pale and steady, and Anna walked on, unaware that each step drew her closer to the fate whispered through stone and shadow. Manole rose, trembling, and met her at the foundation. He spoke to her gently, framing it as a simple request, to remain there while he placed the next stones. She trusted him completely, her eyes filled with love and faith, believing in the care of his hands that had guided every block of the monastery. As the first stones were laid, the walls began to rise. Anna looked up at Manole, a question forming on her lips, a flicker of fear in her voice. "The wall, it is tightening," she whispered. Manole could only nod, his throat tight with grief, unable to undo what had begun. Each stone pressed heavier, each layer enclosing her more, and the truth of the sacrifice became undeniable. The law of the monastery had claimed her, and nothing could reverse it. The masons worked in silence, their hands steady, their hearts heavy. They had agreed to the rule, and now they followed it, their labor entwined with horror and inevitability. Anna's trust had been absolute, and the cruel design of fate made it all the more piercing. Stone after stone rose around her, becoming a tomb. She did not struggle, yet her whispered fear and the tightening walls marked the moment when love and devotion were transformed into tragedy. The monastery, at last, held firm. The walls that had collapsed now stood, unyielding, sealed by the human cost it demanded. A silence followed, heavy and sorrowful, broken only by the faint whisper of wind through the arches. Manole had prayed to save her, and yet the vision of the dream had come to pass. Life, love, and hope had been walled into stone. After Anna was taken by the walls, the masons no longer faltered. The monastery began to gleam against the sky, each arch locked in place, each tower lifted higher as though heaven itself no longer resisted. Day by day, the great work neared its end. Frescoes spread across the inner walls, saints and angels seeming to breathe in the dim light of candles. The vision of Prince Nego Basarab was nearly fulfilled, a monastery unlike any other in the land, a jewel of faith and power in the heart of Wallachia. The people came to marvel. Villagers whispered that this was no ordinary building, that stone alone could never have held so firm, that surely a deeper force had bound it together. The monastery stood as both triumph and tomb, its beauty inseparable from its price. When the last tile was set upon the roof, Manole and his masons remained atop it, gazing over the valley. Pride and sorrow mingled in their eyes. They had built a monument that would outlast their names, yet every stone reminded Manole of the woman entombed within it. Prince Nego came to behold what his craftsmen had achieved. At first he stood in awe, his heart swelling at the sight of the towers that seemed to pierce the heavens. But soon awe gave way to unease. If these men could raise such wonder once, could they not do so again, perhaps greater still, for another ruler who might tempt them with gold and promise? The thought took root, growing dark and bitter. He could not risk being outshone, could not allow this masterpiece to be rivaled. His legacy must stand alone. And so, with cold command, he gave the order. The scaffolds were to be removed, the ladders taken away. Manole and his masons, still upon the roof, were left stranded against the sky. The monastery was complete, magnificent beyond measure. Yet in the moment of its triumph, betrayal sealed the fate of those who had built it. The wind circled the monastery's towers as the masons looked down from the roof, their triumph soured into a trap. Below, the scaffolds lay scattered, the ladders gone. No path remained but the sky itself. For a time, they stood in silence, the weight of the prince's order sinking in. They had given their skill, their strength, and their blood. Now they were to give their lives as well. Yet none could bear to wait for hunger or thirst to end them. So they turned to the scraps at hand, planks and broken pieces of timber left from their labor. In desperate haste, they bound them together, shaping crude wings. If their craft could raise a monastery toward heaven, perhaps it could lift their own bodies too. One by one, they strapped the wings to their arms and leapt into the air. For an instant, each seemed suspended, carried by the wind, but the earth allowed no flight. Their bodies struck the ground beyond the monastery walls, lives broken as swiftly as their fragile wings. Last remained Manole. He had dreamed of sacrifice, had buried his wife within the stones, and had raised the monastery higher than any before. Now he stood alone against the sky. With a prayer upon his lips, he spread his wooden wings and cast himself into the air. Where he fell, water is said to have sprung from the ground, a spring flowing clear and cold, as though the earth itself mourned him. To this day, it bears his name, the Fountain of Manole, a final reminder of the builder's fate and of the price beauty demands. The story of Manole is not only a tale of faith and sacrifice, but a memory rooted in stone. The monastery at Curtea de Argeș stands to this day, its towers carved with delicate patterns, its walls glowing pale in the sun, its domes lifting the eye toward heaven. Visitors speak of its beauty as unmatched, a monument not only of architecture but of devotion. Yet behind its grace lies the shadow of the legend. Every arch recalls the price that was said to bind it together. Every stone whispers of Anna's voice fading within the walls. To the people, the monastery was never only stone and mortar. It was a living reminder that human greatness demands a cost, and that beauty often conceals sorrow. Just beyond the monastery, a fountain still flows, the place where the master builder's body struck the earth when he leapt from the roof. Pilgrims drink from it, not only for refreshment, but as part of the story, a ritual that keeps the legend alive. To walk the grounds of Curtea de Argeș is to move between history and myth. The monastery was indeed raised under the patronage of Prince Neago Basarab in the early 1500s, a marvel of Byzantine style and Romanian craft. But the tale of sacrifice gave it a soul, binding the real with the imagined, the visible with the hidden. The legend endures because it speaks to something deeper than its setting. It is about creation and loss, about the weight of ambition, and about the human longing to leave behind a work that outlasts life itself. At Curtea de Argeș Monastery, stone and story became one, and together they continue to remind us that beauty is never without a price.